All right. Well, it's officially 3:30, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. And so today's panel is great. So today's panel is on brain-computer interfaces, open source tools, and the future of augmented cognition. My name is Sean Montgomery, and I brought together this specific panel today because I wanted to address something I call the information processing gap, which is, in the last few years, humanity has created more data than throughout the entirety of human history. And that's likely to continue as we go forward with exponential growth in data. And yet, the ability of the human brain to process data is likely to be relatively linearly increasing, if increasing at all on its own accord. And so I think that creates a really interesting conundrum that this particular group of speakers might have some things to say about. And I think one way that I think about it, and that a number of people think about it, is with reference to internal context. Our ability to process data changes from moment to moment. For example, if you're driving and you're texting at the same time, your ability to process that car that's merging into your lane is different when you're responding to somebody's text message than if you're paying full attention to the road. And the way that we think about this, I think each in slightly different ways, is in the context of sensing signals from the body. There are constantly signals running through the body, electrical, chemical, mechanical, and all of them are reflecting our moment-by-moment changes in our personal vantage point. And so I think one possible way to manage the future of ever exponentially increasing data is to think about how internal context combined with algorithms, artificial intelligence, can help to mitigate this fire hose of data and deliver the information you need when you need it in order to make the critical decision that you need to make at that moment in time. And so there's a lot to discuss on this issue, and I brought together this particular panel to start thinking about that and discuss with you all how that can go forward, what the challenges are, both technical and ethical, and where we can carry this conversation going forward as we head further into the 21st century. So I wanted to introduce everyone. My name, everyone, they insisted I introduce myself first. My name is Sean Montgomery. My background is in neuroscience. I got my PhD in neuroscience in 2009. And since then, I've been working at different companies, leading teams, developing hardware and software that are measuring internal context, sensing signals from the body, and then trying to make sense out of those signals. I teach at sometimes different places, NYU, Hunter, other places, and I run a consulting company called Connected Future Labs, where we help people sense signals from the body and make sense out of those signals. And most recently, Connected Future Labs is launching a product called EmotiBit, which is an open source wearable sensor for picking up, it picks up 16 different signals from the body and then kind of lets you do whatever you want with those signals. Here's an example of those signals streaming off of probably my body at one point in time. So that's all I wanted to say about myself, and then I'm going to hand it off to Heidi. I believe I met you at an artist residency at HarvestWorks, maybe, a number of years back. And we've kind of stayed in touch ever since, and she does amazing work, so I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Are you going to run the slides?
Yeah, and you can see up here too. Just tell me when you want.
So I think we're each going to do about 2 minutes of just like intros, and then we have a series of questions. So a little bit, I guess, about my background. I come at it more from like kind of a human rights perspective. So I run a company called Future Perfect Lab, and we basically work at the intersection of pop culture, emerging technology, social change, and a lot of that work is informed by neuroscience. So for many years, I made video games about immigration and these sorts of things. But then I kind of had a crisis of faith about that work, and I wondered whether or not the work that I was actually making was changing the attitudes and the behaviors and kind of expanding content knowledge in the way that we envisioned it. So I decided to go back and do a PhD to sort of understand what we could gather empirically. But in the process of doing that, I ended up making large-scale network dance and theater pieces because I thought that might be one way of mitigating kind of like the eroding amygdala and hippocampus issues that are happening as a result of our interaction or our dependence upon intelligent technology. And so when I was working on that dance piece, we developed the XSense with my collaborator Marco Donnarumma, which is a similar kind of biophysical sensor. We call it a biocreative instrument. Are you just, you're advancing?
Just trying to help, but
okay.
You can tell me to slow down, that's fine.
Okay, so the XSense basically reads all sorts of things. It reads your heart rate, your blood flow, your muscle contraction and release, as well as IMU data like spatial accelerometer, gyroscope, magnetometer. And similarly, basically you can take that over like Open Sound Protocol and then remap it to a whole host of third-party software from like processing to like, Max MSP, PD, Unity, a whole host of things. So basically you can use, these floating values to remap any sort of content that you want. So in the process of developing that, you can move forward. I realized I could actually use the XSense and a whole host of other sensors to better understand media effects, right? How does both intelligent technology or media, like films, episodic television, games, and all of those things, how do they actually affect us neurobiologically? And so for the past several years, I've been building this open source biometric lab, which I call the Limbic Lab. And it basically reads a whole source of measurements, not only like the biophysical, so I use the XSense, but I also use Conor's device, the OpenBCI, which I won't get into, facial recognition, eye tracking, and GSR data, as somebody is viewing specific type of content, which I call stimuli. And then what I've done is I've also incorporated story coding, so I've mapped a whole bunch of different content in terms of their narrative structure and arc, but I've only taken the data from the salient narrative nodes, and then that gets passed into, into a database that I can also combine with demographic and psychographic data. And so essentially what I'm building is kind of this massive database, which is like what I call the media genome. So I can take in all of these different data sources across various media, and then the larger the database becomes, the more nuanced the predictive models become. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I guess we can stop there.
Hello.
Cool. Sorry. And this is Conor Russomanno. I believe I met you just as you were graduating from DT. And we've been kind of back and forth ever since, and working on various projects together. And it's really a pleasure to kind of come back here with you and hear what you've done since and what you think about the world.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, actually, we did meet when I was at Parsons. I was a grad student actually, and I very quickly got interested in brain-computer interfaces. They were pretty, at least low cost. BCI was very new at the time, and Sean happened to be giving this workshop somewhere in Brooklyn, and it was the first ever lecture that I received on brain-computer interfaces. Sean was giving it. And then that became like my career. So, this is like coming full circle, which is pretty cool. After grad school, I co-founded a company called OpenBCI, which is an open source brain-computer interface company. More broadly, we basically build the Arduino biosensors, and we sell this Arduino compatible PCB that you can plug electrodes into, and you can connect those electrodes to your body, and you can measure brain activity, muscle activity, heart activity, and then IMU data. And then that crazy thing I'm wearing on my head in that picture is called the Ultra Cortex, which is a 3D printed EEG headset. So all of these tools are open source, and you can go and find the schematics or the design files online, and you can make them yourself, or you can save yourself the time and buy them from us. I met Guillermo actually through the MIT Media Lab. I'm now a research affiliate, so I go up there and hang out with him sometimes, which is really cool because he'll get to it, but he's a really amazing creator. And then formerly was a adjunct professor at ITP, but then also Parsons MFAET, where I taught creative coding. So I taught processing and open frameworks and Arduino. And then I did a stint in San Francisco where I got to work with augmented reality headsets. So I worked at a company called Meta, and I had a really cool job title called Director of Advanced Interfaces, which was basically just a glorified title for prototyping, like fusing EEG and biometrics into AR headsets. So I did that for a little bit and then came back to New York and am now back running OpenBCI full time again. I'm sure you can read the professional interest there, but we'll get into it as we progress into the talk. So pass it off to Guillermo. Cool.
And I also wanted to mention that your software for OpenBCI is written in processing.
Yep.
So a good time for the day as well. And then Guillermo I actually met through Conor through OpenBCI just several months ago now. Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure working with him and hearing his ideas as he's working through his PhD thesis, very much at the heart of brain-computer interface and augmented cognition, and what that means, and how to think about the next century in this area. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. So if you could go to the next slide, I think this kind of gives you on how I started to get into this was part of my master's thesis, or some of the work that for that thesis, that we begin to look into like the idea of brain-computer interface, not only for signals that are generated from the brain, but there's all these different driven structures in our cognitive processes that are actually driving a lot of our decision making. And the more I start to see how these high-level features, the more we can construct them and integrate them in interfaces, I could actually understand when a user was going through the decision-making process of creating something. I have a design background for my undergraduate, and I'm very much interested in how do we make certain decisions, when do we actually get into these flows of working and ideating and exploring, and now we're more open to explore new ideas than other times. So I wanted to understand what are like the objective metrics that we can actually begin to gather that allow us to have some insight into the user, and I started to develop adaptive interfaces that can actually understand and help the user to move forward. So this was doing with just simple heart rate variability, electrodermal activity, and a camera. But as I started to look into other interfaces like AR and VR, tools that are being used heavily in like a lot of cognitive behavioral studies, a lot of the face interface or the face information is going away. So I started to develop some of the tools that are not currently available, at least at low cost, or very, I don't know if you can actually get something that gives you so much resolution. So I started to develop these kits that start to give us information on like similar to what you heard before, muscle activation of the face, creating models that actually tell you the different facial expressions that the user is doing while they're perceiving these VR experiences, as well like their eye movements, some brain activity from like the prefrontal cortex, as well as electrodermal activity. And that's how it kind of Conor and I connected, because there was a lot of overlap into our work. And I think we can get more in depth on those things, but let's just leave it there for now. And go.
Cool. Cool. So that's kind of who we have here, and then I wanted to go through and just begin touching some of these topics. So I have a few questions that I thought we would discuss as a group, and then what I really want to do is open it up for you all to ask questions and help us think about how to think about these issues from different angles. So the first question is, what is a brain-computer interface? And how do you see augmented cognition affecting our interaction with the world and society as a whole over the next 10, 50, 100 years? So I'll pose it to you, Heidi, and then we can just hop around.
But he makes the brain-computer interfaces. Yeah, I guess for me, I don't think about it in that context. I think of cognition, so I don't think about just it being the brain itself, but really more of the mind. I think we're going to have a conversation around that. So I see it as more of like an active negotiation between the brain, the body, and our environment. And oftentimes we scaffold onto the environment all sorts of responsibilities. So the increase in immersion oftentimes, in an experience, whether it's media or whatnot, actually increases the level to which we actually offload onto the environment, So in terms of our cognitive processes. So for me, when I think about sort of the augmentation factor, I think about a couple of things. One of which is these devices, have a capacity. And what I was originally interested in terms of dance was, what can I externalize that is not naturally visible? And then when I'm gathering this data, how can I create a feedback loop to increase the impact of a particular type of media on people? So if I can gather a bunch of different data sources and triangulate those data sources, not just from the brain, but in different registers, how can we then both understand the effects of media and technology, but also think about the future, which is bioadaptive, or what I've been calling biomedia, which is a term for factor, actually. But how can we actually think about the future of media, which is bioadaptive experiences? We get all of these registers coming in real time. We know this technology is actually going to continue to shrink, potentially entering into our bodies. And then what sort of media landscape will we be creating in like the next 50 years? And how will it be responding to us real time, biophysically? I know we're only supposed to keep our response to a minute.
Cool. Yeah, I think Heidi made a great point about kind of differentiating or between the looking or peering into the brain and looking and peering into the mind. I think that especially when you're new to the space, it's very easy to conflate the two and to kind of put them into the same bin. But at least as far as the body is concerned, there's a lot of data that you can record not from the brain that is a very vivid representation of the mind, or that you can use to understand the mind in the context of its environment. Because we don't actually really care about the brain; we really care about the individual, the thoughts and the emotions of the individual, which is really the mind. And so, while the company, OpenBCI stands for Open Source Brain Computer Interface, over time, I was kind of like, oh, we're kind of locked into this now. But really, we care a lot more about than just. We care a lot more we care about a lot more than just the brain. We care about the mind. We care about understanding the mind in the context of the environment. I don't know if you added this slide, the one with the loopy picture. But there's one diagram that I like to use to kind of this one here. I don't know if you can read this, but I'm going to try and keep this brief. But as I think it's important to think about this as we start using devices to understand the mind. We're going to be putting that information somewhere, right? And right now we live in this world where most of our interaction with a computer is conscious. We use keyboards, we use speech to text, we use inputs that we're aware of. But the direction that we're heading is for more and more of this information to actually be subconscious. So like subconscious inputs into a machine, where it starts to get interesting as this technology evolves is when that machine starts using that information to put feedback back into us to change the way we think or change the way we act or our emotions. And so I think that over time we're going to start moving away from this conscious input feedback, which is the middle arrows, towards a more subconscious loop where we have applications and systems in the background of our technology and wearable devices that are processing the multimodal representation of our mind and using that to influence the content that it puts back into our audio, visual, haptic systems. And so, I'm going to let Guillermo jump into it now, but I think we can maybe riff on that a bit.
Yeah, and I'm not going to touch on what BCI is because I think I agree with you guys, but you asked about the future and how we see it as an interface. And where I get very excited is when these tools begin to give us insight into ourselves, and begin to learn about what things work for us that are very different. We come from ways of learning in school that is kind of generalized for everyone. We learn to do our work and decision making in a certain way, but each person begins to have different attention spans or times of the day that your energy levels are different levels that you're more susceptible to actually integrate that information into yourself. So what happens when the interfaces begin to be aware and you're learning this information? So if you look into like a lot of the artists that are like Jojo and like choreographers, Tyla, sorry, I cannot remember the name, but there's she has a book about their routines and rituals. Yes, and I think what makes it different is that a lot of people are able to learn what works for them and what different environments and processes begin to allow them to get into a mindset or discover or learn certain topics. Not everyone goes through that process, so can technology begins to be our self-discovery tool that then we can self-improve and allow the knowledge. So I'm very much interested in BCI tools because it's something that is allowing us to have a richer understanding on our own processes that are not clearly evident to ourselves.
Can you repeat the name of the book, please? Oh. Sorry, do you mind repeating the name of the book?
Oh, I think it's called The Creative Habit by Twyla Tharp.
Yes.
Is that the book?
Yes, exactly. Okay.
One of the things I'd like to pick up on this kind of personalized nature, because part of my belief is that we're going to be seeing a movement from mass media strategies, which we've had for 100 years or so, to what I would call like personalized strategies beyond these filter bubbles. But in terms of the tool that I've been building, we can actually see almost what I would call like your personalized media DNA, right? So each person's viewing a particular type of content, then you get sort of like a media imprint, right, based on your biophysical response, but also all of this kind of like self-reporting and other types of survey data. So you combine those things into like a unique profile that essentially creates like your unique personal media DNA, which if we look at that real time as we start to automate media production processes, right, we're going to see the type of personalization that you were just expressing.
I kind of like to think of, in this chart, I fantasize about this future where there's this little, like, basically AI Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio that's like sitting in your computer or your smartphone or whatever. Like, we'll probably be wearing AR headsets, but this little agent in the background ideally is optimizing the feedback that's coming back into your body to bias you towards emotions and activities that you want to be doing and away from feelings and things that are negative. But obviously there's a lot of ethical considerations there because like who's in control of building those apps, who gets to program the high-level parameters of this kind of background agent that's able to create a cocktail of feedback that you get to perceive. I think that leads to a lot of questions about like the design of these tools and these applications and who's in control of what those systems look like. Ideally, we are as the users and as the generators of the data, but that's kind of to be determined.
Cool.
Scary.
So I think that's actually a great segue to the next question. So sensing signals and collecting data from the body presents a host of challenges. Those challenges range from technical to ethical. How do you address these challenges in your work? Who wants to go first? Conor, you've got the mic.
Okay. I think a great place to start, and maybe we'll get to this later in the conversation, but just the value of open source and the value of making technology and tools accessible to everyone and trying to lower the barrier of entry, both to participating in the creation of tools, but also just the understanding and the knowledge of what these technologies are actually capable of. I don't think that open source is like the end all solution to preventing tyranny and capitalism from destroying collective human consciousness, but it's at least a start, kind of leveling the playing field and allowing people to get involved early in education. But yeah, no, it's a tough question because it's, I think it's one way to address it as a designer or engineer or entrepreneur is to kind of forecast certain future scenarios that you want to avoid, and then just like design around them now, like build an alternative to that scenario and move people towards the alternative, which is easier said than done, but that's the best I've come up with at this point in my career, is kind of just trying to lead by example and say, hey, let's do it this way, and like let's forecast or speculate about a scenario that we don't want to end up at, and just like design an alternative.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like everything I've ever made has always been open source because I believe in making the tools available for our community. So in terms of the XSense, the main kind of target audience at that time was really other artists, giving people the tools, choreographers, game designers, the ability to kind of use these tools to enhance their own practice, so making them both accessible and also lowering the bar for creativity as well for people with that are differently abled. But then, since I've been building out the Limbic Lab, a whole other set of questions have started to surface. The reason why I started building this is because there are people like Nielsen Neuro, like scary people that are building labs, right, to do this for like advertising and marketers and other sorts of people. But nobody in my community, in terms of like social justice, cultural and educational organizations, had access to these tools, right, because they're building them in a kind of hard-coded, like no access way. And so I decided to build out this tool, right, this whole lab environment. And one of my main questions now is like, if you build a tool, but it could still be turned into a weapon, right? Should you continue to build that tool? And if so, how? And are there, does everything have to be open source? Like, I believe it should be open source so we have, the community has access to these tools, but at the same time it presents, a potential disastrous situation if like DARPA or, marketers want to have access to this media genome, right? And so some of the things I've been thinking about are building alternative licensing models, right, beyond kind of like the MIT model. But another real alternative could really be building it in a proprietary way so that only the communities that want to have access to those tools have access to them and it's not abused in some way. So I don't know, I'm kind of in a conundrum right now, so.
I don't have the answer for that, but I can tell you what we're doing in our lab as a research group. And I'm going to start first like at the high level and then at the hardware level. So we have weekly group meetings where each one of us is presenting how the research is moving along, the new project, and so on. And one of the exercises that we're beginning to do is like we begin to challenge each project into like, how would I spin this into like something that I don't want to see, like for like an evil or someone that has like a bad intention with this technology. How can I begin to turn into that? So then we are aware on how to implement new design strategies to prevent those kind of situations. We also begin to bring historians, we bring psychologists, bring people from different angles that have nothing to do with the technical components that we're building, just to get their perspective and get the point of view or something that is not in our wheelhouse, that they can give us a fresh set of eyes to rethink a lot of these models. So that's something that is just happening as a methodology. You can think as a way that we're building and thinking about every decision that we're doing. Because when we're doing something, an implementation of a project, a tool, whatever, you're so into making it, trying to get it to work and to do what you want to do that sometimes you forget about these other things. So this is kind of like at the higher level. And then some of the things that we're collaborating now, I met Sean, is that I'm doing all this new series of hardware. And then we're beginning to do a lot of the decisions at the hardware level where the signals are being encrypted. And can we actually have a better control on who has access to this data and how is that being moved? So now it's not just hardware, open source hardware, but it's open source hardware that gives you these tools and the information can be stored locally Some of the things that I'm very excited is like there's these new machine learning models like speed learning, where now some of the data stays local, and you have like this larger model, and you're just training a model locally, uploading it to this larger, so now you're no longer sharing that private data. So beginning to keep that in mind and have it as a part of the conversation, I think is just one thing that it's important to do. If it's not even part of the conversation or as you're developing, then most likely you're going to miss a lot of things where things can go wrong.
Can I ask a question?
Actually, yes. I have one more question about open source tools, but we've already kind of touched on it, and I would like to instead open it up to the audience.
So I'm going to be really delicate about how I say this. No, I'll talk loud.
Is that okay for the video?
You know, I'm old, and I can look at this thing as a device of wonder, because I knew when this thing was like 20 different things and they were all heavy. And I'm not saying my daughter is stupid or her friends, but you made a comment earlier about texting and driving, and so I think so much is happening with technology and phones and where we're advanced. I don't want to even talk about good and evil anymore. I want to talk about drop any of us in Queens, and I would not know how to get home because of GPS, right? So there are all these advancements that in a lot of ways are altering to the point where we're almost not becoming human anymore. So to go back to your statement where you opened up with about like, maybe we want it, like my car puts on the brakes because it sees shit in front of me that, and I'm still paying attention. Anyway, how do you guys wrestle with the fact that maybe you're in the same age category as me that sees the wonder in this, but there's a part of me that looks at my daughter, and I'm not saying that her and her friends are dumb, but I look at the younger generation and I think, it's amazing how they have so much access to knowledge and they're the dumbest people I know.
So you're not saying they're dumb.
I'm not saying it. But to that point, like how do you go down this path of doing the stuff that you're doing, which is almost like getting people away from being human?
Yep, absolutely.
Actually, it's funny you mentioned, I wrote my dissertation on the social, cultural, and neurobiological effects of intelligent technology. And the title of the dissertation was Re-Becoming Human. So,
The subtext is, why is my daughter dumb?
yeah. No, it was actually restoring critical feeling through ludic performance. So part of what I discovered, is many of the things you've observed, like on a cognitive level, right? We know that there's a lot of damage that's being done using our, all of these various devices. But in particular, there are two areas in the brain that are being affected: the amygdala and the hippocampus region of the brain, which are responsible for two things, well, many things, but in this case, they're responsible for memory consolidation, right? And emotion regulation and activation, and our ability to create knowledge schemas, right? Make meaning from the world. And there have been a number of studies. You can read my dissertation. I don't want to go into that here, but I do think, part of the reason why I'm doing the work I'm doing now is because I'm trying to actually understand the effects of technology and media by using these forms of, enhanced cognition, I guess we're using as the term for the thing, but using different types of physiological measures to understand and triangulating it with other data sets to be able to understand how technology is affecting us, but not on the short term, but in the long term. And if we know that, what's the other trajectory we can take in terms of creating content that is more what I would call like narrative medicine? How can we create content that's inclusive, accessible, and it's not harmful? So.
But I don't think Mark Zuckerberg was thinking about that when he created Facebook, knowing that Cambridge Analytica was going to hijack our presidency.
Yeah.
So you're doing all this stuff, and then what if you get to the point where it does become evil, or it is too late?
Yeah.
Should happen.
So it's a great question, and this is why I brought up the point. It's like I'd rather, at least as a creator and entrepreneur, I'd rather be involved in the process of building the things than just let it happen to me. And maybe that's just kind of like accepting that it's coming and being like, all right, cool, I'm gonna do everything I can to guide or like to move the needle in a slight direction where I want it to be, right? one thing that you brought up was like the whole, the texting and driving. I'm really excited about certain aspects of technology. Like I'm very excited about augmented reality, like VR and AR, just head-mounted displays. I think that phones, there was the era where smartphones didn't work on the subway, and people like read books and they looked at each other and they talked to each other, and then all of a sudden service was introduced in the subway, and now like you're on the subway and everyone is like this the whole time, right? And it's just it's taking humanity out of the subway, and so for that reason, like I am excited for the future scenario where like we get rid of this like teeny little rectangle that we stare at, and we actually have like the ability to see the real world and interact with the real world, but that we can kind of turn up or turn down the presence of the content in our, stitched into the real world. Obviously there are scary things that come along with that, like do you actually have control, and like if once it's there, are you just gonna turn it up to max volume all the time, and you're just gonna have like screens all over the place and you're gonna not pay attention to what's in the real world anyway. But like for me, I'm tired of my neck hurting. I'm tired of like looking around at everyone else looking down at their phone. I'd rather have it here and be able to stand up straight and talk to people while I interact with technology. I'm not sure where I was going with this, but the question that you asked is a really good one. I think it's like for me personally, I'd rather just be involved in it and try and influence it to the best of my ability.
And I wanted to add also that I think we've been throughout the history of humanity discovering what it means to be human, and rediscovering and recreating what it means to be human. But every time we create a new tool, whether that's agriculture or the hammer or the nuclear bomb, we've been rediscovering what it means for us to be here and what it means to be a society and to be in that society. And it's been thorny throughout history, and I think it's going to continue to be thorny. And I think these conversations are an important piece for me to make it a little more like a utopia and a little less like a dystopia at the end of the day. Let's see. How about right here? Oh, also, Marcus. Marcus is going to hand around an email sign up. If you have any interest of joining our email list, please sign up there. You wanted to ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah. This sort of in relation, I guess, to the slide that's up there. So you brought up this concept of subconscious feedback and then this sort of feedback loop of that. Can you give a sort of real-world, tangible example of what that would actually look like? Because you bring up the sort of ethics behind that, and to me it's very kind of easy to wrap my head around how it could be used for, I guess evil is the word that's been thrown around a lot. But if you can, sort of what would be like a net positive, like real world example of this subconscious feedback loop where we're receiving this subconscious feedback, and then what's sort of the objective or the end result of that?
Yeah, great question. And I've been trying to think of the most tangible example that I could come up with recently. And the best one I've come up with so far, I think there are lots, but they get kind of vague pretty quick. But I think a tangible one, and that's fairly timely, is imagine sometime in the last decade you got addicted to opiates. A lot of people have, and then trying to get off of opiates is very hard, and you go through this withdrawal process. That withdrawal process is very measurable. You could measure it if you stuck any host of sensors on your body. And you could use that, you could sense withdrawal, and you could use it to filter your reality, to get rid of your triggers, right? Addiction comes with triggers. We know that those triggers can cause you to relapse in a strong way. And so if you have control over this subconscious, if you have control of the knobs that this subconscious loop are creating, you could filter out of your reality those triggers, and you could then get off of opiates. So that's kind of the utopian vision in this example. And then there's another vision. Imagine if you don't have control over those knobs. imagine if Purdue Pharma has control over those knobs. What would they do with the knowledge that you're withdrawing? Well, my guess is they'd show you an ad for OxyContin. So I think that's the acute vision that I see that distinguishes between kind of these utopian and dystopian visions.
There are also like fun examples too. I mean, there are tons of medical examples. For instance, gaming. Like, how many people here play video games or have played games and enjoy games? Probably a lot. So different people react differently. So if you're watching a horror movie, certain aspects of a horror movie might scare you more than others. And imagine if the movie knew that, and the movie could bias you towards certain emotions. So like if it was true. Right. So like, there's actually a great, what's that show called? Black Mirror. This comes up a lot in Black Mirror, but basically it's kind of like psychological feedback loops where you can bias people or kind of like understand what's generating a certain emotion in a specific person, and kind of like, oh, that's working. We're gonna ramp this one up. So I like to think of like in entertainment and in media, like the idea of playing a game that understands the way that you're reacting to certain characters or certain aspects of the narrative, and then uses that knowledge to change the future, the rest of the game. In fact, my thesis here at MFADT was like a watered down version of this. It was using, it was an interactive graphic novel where throughout the story, your EEG was being recorded, and then that changed the plot of the story, so you got to different endings based on your subconscious reaction to the content. Now it was like very, very simplistic, but I think that could be, with resources and game designers, could be baked out into a really, really immersive storytelling or gaming experience where it's like max fun. You're playing the coolest game you've ever played because it's like evolving to you as you're playing it.
In the back, in the white shirt?
Yeah. How, like, in a concrete sense, where are you with like brain interfaces? I mean, you mentioned you've mentioned detecting emotions. Have you made any strides in like intent, or like, I mean, what levels are you at with like interpreting these signals?
I can start. Yeah, sure. Starting at the highest, starting kind of at at a technical level, if you measure half a dozen or a dozen signals from the body, you can separate emotions in a specific context with 80% reliability. You can separate 6 to 8 emotions with 80% reliability. So that's kind of just a ballpark. It depends a lot on a lot of things. So that's the technical answer, but then the bigger answer is that we have no real strong clue how the brain works. So there's 100 billion neurons in the brain, which is about as many galaxies as there are in the universe as far as we know. And we don't really know the fundamental operating principles of the brain. So we can do a lot of cool tricks. We can do things you've probably seen, replaying movies that people have seen. By looking at their brain activity, you can see what movie they're watching or what they're thinking about. But there's a lot we still don't know. And so it's kind of an evolving process, figuring out what the brain is doing and how we can understand what it's doing.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that there's the data that is available is like highly tailored a lot for the applications. Like, and I don't even know what you mean by intent. Intent to move my hand or to think about something.
Mainly the idea that I have in my head was like, you were talking about the subconscious feedback loop, and you were also talking about like, I don't know if you were talking about Google Maps, and I don't know why I was thinking Google Maps, but I mean, you could essentially, instead of having like a voice, could you, with the technology we have right now, could you essentially like kind of just have the person zone out, and then how sometimes you like just kind of walk without really thinking where you're going?
Mind wandering.
I mean, yeah, you could literally lead the person with sufficient technology to their destination. And I'm wondering, is the
it's not
There's a
there.
lot of people doing that with haptics.
No, I mean there are things that we can do. Like we're talking about like intent to move. There are like regions in the brain that you can kind of understand that, and you can pick it up from the motor cortex. So on, if you're trying about mind wandering, there's like a series of brainwaves that we can pick up. But that doesn't mean anything if you like. It's not that precise as you might be thinking about. And a lot of the settings in which you have an understanding of this is highly controlled, and there's a lot of things that you understand, so you can begin to look into that. But I would say it's like it's a highly structured way to understand it, but nothing that is general.
That's kind of comforting, actually.
I think we're out of time.
Last question. I think you have your hand.
Yes, it was a bit of a meta question, but you kind of mentioned a lot of interesting directions in the science and the research. So, is there any sort of framework that, as a society, humanity would can employ to safely try them out, and then see what works and what? Because it's, as you know, we can be really well intended, but we cannot foresee all the possible circumstances. We can plan around them, but we cannot understand what it's going to be like to live in the world with this being really accessible, just like cell phones now. So, is there any sort of conceptual framework that, you know, leading minds of the industry are thinking about, some sort of like sandbox environments of US where we can try out all sort of things?
Now that I know.
The internet.
I don't know, I mean, yeah, so your question is, you know, as we're starting to incubate these things, is that what you're suggesting? Is there an environment where you can go so that you can understand how the applications actually work and the potentiality of them? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, like in terms of my research, you know, I mean, I do proper IRB, you know, research, and so, you know, I have they're more controlled settings and they're very context specific, right? So I'll reach out, I have a certain sample size, and so, you know, and I go to different parts of the country. So, I mean, it's not necessarily like an open sandbox, right? And they're really about sort of, we do like human subjects research, so people are coming into lab environments like that. But I do think that that is an important thing to raise, considering that, you know, when we're building the tools, the idea is that biotechnology for everybody, right? So what are the spaces where we could set up some of these environments? So one of the things that we're doing with our research is that I have a partnership with the Norman Lear Center and also the Paley Center. And so we're actually creating like, this is your brain on X. And so I'm doing a study right now looking at episodic television specifically. And so people will be able to come in and actually watch something and see actually how their brain and body are reacting to that content real time, and more of like the intent is really to render science more accessible to lay people. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at in terms of having access to, but it's not about creating a sandbox where you can play with these things yourself.
Yeah, it's not a direct answer to your question about the sandboxing, but I do think as a principle, or a couple of principles that make sense to me, are open source, being able to see the algorithms that are controlling our realities makes a lot of sense. You know, if you can, same as the way OpenSSH can be peered into, and we can know when we're being compromised, I think that's an opportunity for us to apply that principle to our reality filtering as well. And data ownership is another place that particularly this country is a little behind on, where if you own your data and you control where it goes and who can be using it for what, I think there's bringing that control back to the individual makes a lot of sense. And we're out.
We're done.